Welcome to another episode of Yalla, the podcast of Jewish students brought to you by the Union of Jewish Students of the UK and Ireland. I'm Rebecca, the Israel Engagement and Mental Health Awareness Sabbatical Officer.
And I'm Yahel, a university student at the Glasgow School of Art.
On today's episode of Yalla, we're thrilled to be joined by Gil Hovav, a household name in Israel and one of the most beloved culinary figures in the country. Gil is a famous TV presenter, journalist, restaurant critic, and author of best-selling recipe books.
Gil comes from one of the most respected families in the Jewish world. He's the great-grandson of Eliezer ben Yehuda, the reviver of the modern Hebrew language, the grandson of Itamar ben Avi, who began modern journalism in Israel, and the son of Moshe and Dror Hovav, founding members of Israel's modern-day public radio.
We're thrilled to have him with us today to talk about his journey, his family's legacy, and of course, food. Welcome, Gil, and thank you for being here.
Shalom, I'm very happy to be here with you. Thank you for thinking about me and approaching.
Great. So we're gonna start with some questions about your personal life and upbringing. So the first one will be about Jerusalem. Jerusalem is such a culturally and historically rich city. How did its atmosphere shape your worldview and passions?
Well, actually, the answer is a bit sad because I'm no longer a Jerusalemite. I was born in Jerusalem in 1962, and I have lived in Jerusalem for 25 years and then moved to Tel Aviv, like most of my friends from my generation. Almost none of my friends from high school stayed in Jerusalem. They either moved to the suburbs of Jerusalem or to Tel Aviv or even to places more further to the west. Jerusalem, when I was growing up in Jerusalem, it was an amazing city. I wrote a trilogy about Jerusalem, about growing up in Jerusalem, of short stories about my family and childhood in Jerusalem. It has changed. It became much more tense and much more religious. Now, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, a city may be religious, people may be religious. It's good that religious people have a city of their own, but it's not tolerant and it's not pleasant, and it's a beautiful place to visit, but it's an unpleasant city to live in. And I chose to leave Jerusalem. So for me, there will always be two Jerusalems. The Jerusalem I knew in my childhood and in my youth, and then Jerusalem of nowadays, which is a very difficult city, and Tel Aviv is much nicer.
And your family played an integral role in the emergence and development of Israel. What stories about your great-grandfather Eliezer ben Yehuda or your grandfather Itamar ben Avi were passed down to you?
Oh, many stories. I didn't know both. Both of them died. Eliezer ben Yehuda died 40 years before I was born. Itamar ben Avi, my grandfather, the first Hebrew child, died 20 years before I was born. But I grew up with, of course, with my parents and my brother, but also with my grandmother, the wife of Itamar ben Avi, and she was in love with him before she married him, after she married him, before he died, after he died, and she educated me for the first 20 years of my life, and through her, I really lived the legacy of the Ben Yehuda family because they were with her every minute. And it's not that she was, had a weak personality or, just remembered and that's all. My grandmother was the boss of the world and of her husband, of course. Um, but she was such a fine storyteller and such an amazing woman that through her, I I feel I can say that I knew them, that I lived through the battle of the revival of Hebrew. I really experienced it. And although I was lucky enough to be born in, an independent state with Hebrew as its language, which are all good stuff that my grandfather and great-grandfather did not have, I lived through the fights and through the difficult times as well.
So, growing up in a family so closely tied to the establishment of Israel, did you feel a sense of duty or expectation to carry on their legacy in any way?
It's a very good question. First of all, I feel that I'm obliged to speak Hebrew well, both from both sides of the family. From the Ben Yehuda side, it's because, the revival of Hebrew. And from my father's side, from the Yemenite side, it's because my father was the news announcer of the Israeli radio, and his voice, was considered the voice of God. And he, being a Yemenite, he really educated us to speak, I would say, Hoch Hebrew, like refined Hebrew. And but ever since October 7th, ever since the war began, or ever since the judicial revolution here in Israel began, and people like me feel a bit skeptical about what's going on in Israel, many people start talking about leaving. Now, I don't think I can leave. I don't think I want to leave Israel. I don't think I can leave Israel because I'm an author and I write in Hebrew, and Hebrew is really a part of my life, and Israeli culture is very important to me. And I think that Israel is a miracle that I would not give up so easily. But sometimes I think, and if we do leave Israel, what what would happen to the dream? So this is what we all fought for. This is what my great-grandfather, the two most severe boycotts in Judaism are cast upon our family by the ultra-Orthodox because of his activities to revive Hebrew. So, like, not that I believe in God, God forbid, but if we say that I might die every minute because I'm cursed, so I would leave Israel after I've been cursed, it doesn't sound logical to me. So, so I guess that yes, answering your question, my family legacy keeps me tied to Israel, and also my love towards my homeland, as complicated as it may be.
And with a family that's so deeply tied to the Hebrew language, what role did it play in your childhood and your education?
Um, so as I said, first of all, we had to be fluent speakers, and to speak with respect, to use our language with respect, and um, and also, try to make other people not use foreign language. And up until today, whenever I see a sign of a store or a name of a neighborhood in Israel which is not in Hebrew, it hurts me and it feels not very cultural and not very sophisticated, and I fight this. And also through my journalistic career, I was always like a fighter for Hebrew, and when I became editor in many newspapers, reporters knew that they should report in good Hebrew and not treat their language with disrespect.
We're going to move on to a few questions about food, which is another topic that is really, really important to your life and career. So I wanted to know, what did food mean to you growing up, and how have you showcased your family's heritage within your recipes?
So for me, food is love, and food is should be used to embrace and to show warmth and caring. And this is why I deeply disrespect and do not like all the reality food shows that are so abundant on Israeli television and worldwide. Because I don't think that food should be a competition. I don't think that you should cook to kill, or cook to prove, or cook to compete. You should cook to hug and love. And this is what food was for me when I was growing up. So my family was quite well to do. We had two maids coming every day to where we lived. And my grandmother, whom we lived together, my grandmother was in charge of these two maids, but she did the cooking. Now, my grandmother grew up in one of the richest families in what would become Israel. At the time, it was Palestine. And none of the wealth stayed with us, but she cooked for us the food that she learned how to cook from the servants she used to have when she was a young girl or a young woman. So we used to eat what we called jail food because it was very, very, very basic food. So on one hand, we were quite well to do. On the other hand, we ate really the simplest stuff. And this is the, up until today, it's the food that I love best. So usually people ask me, so what's the best dish in the world for you? And I would say something that's cooked in a pot, not on the grill, with red sauce, with a lid on top of it, served by an elderly woman over 80 years old. This is the best food. And this is the food that I enjoy the most writing about. Although, I love sophisticated restaurants, and I had a TV series called Captain Cook in which I traveled the world for 2 seasons only through three Michelin-starred restaurants. So it's not that I do not appreciate sophisticated food, but if you ask me what's the real oomph in food, it would be love and red sauce.
Amazing. Israel's undergone incredible changes since its founding. From your perspective, how has the role of food and culture evolved in shaping Israeli identity?
I think the turning point, and I was lucky enough to live through it, was somewhere around the beginning of the 80s, where suddenly everybody got rich in America and in Israel, and people started traveling, and they saw that food can be wonderful because up until the 80s, it was almost impolite to eat well in Israel. To eat well, I mean to eat well outside. At home, people cook and it's wonderful, but to dine out, when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, we dined out a lot because both my parents were high up in the communications in Israel and they had careers, and my mother did not cook. So we would go to restaurants. That was very, very, very rare. So in the beginning of the 80s, when I was just starting my journalism career, suddenly things started happening. Just to give you an example, the wine revolution. So up until the 80s, there were two wineries in Israel. Now that there are, I think, the last time we counted, there are 329 or so. So
Wow.
things changed rapidly, as they do in Israel. And suddenly everything was possible. And lots of talent and lots of daring and lots of thinking out of the box and lots of Israeli disrespect to rules. So Israeli chefs always think they can do better than the original dish, and sometimes it's hideous, but sometimes it's wonderful. So I think that this made Israeli cuisine a very colorful amusement park. And this is why it's so successful today, I think.
And how do you think that Israeli cuisine carries sort of the deep cultural and emotional, um, significance of the Israeli and Jewish culture itself?
Sometimes it's problematic. There is the question of kosher or non-kosher food. In Jerusalem, it would be quite difficult to find a non-kosher restaurant. In Tel Aviv, it would be difficult to find a kosher restaurant. So it gives you two perspectives of Israelis towards food. Um, it's it's definitely a part of our culture. Now we have to cope with claims of or accusations of appropriations of dishes. For instance, hummus, which is the battlefield between Israel and Arab countries. Israel was sued by Lebanon for stealing the two national dishes of Lebanon, hummus and the tabbouleh salad. Lebanon lost. On the other hand, Israel and Lebanon had an ongoing competition about the Guinness World Record for the biggest hummus plate ever served. And Israel started it, and then Lebanon replied, and then Israel, and then now the Lebanese hold the world record for the biggest hummus plate. I think these wars are ridiculous. I think food, again, it doesn't belong to a person, and it doesn't belong to a nation, and it doesn't belong to a culture. Food belongs to the land, and in excavations in the Carmel Mount, in caves, it was proven that the Neanderthals were having chickpeas way before Israel was born, and way before the Arabs were born, and way before God was born. Hummus was there already. So I think that everything turns a bit political today, but if you keep focused and look at truth and love, you will be able to stick to good food and not make a fool of yourself.
And you touched on it slightly, but what role do you think food plays in bridging cultural divides within Israel's diverse society?
So I'll give you a funny example. Uh, some years ago, when I was still doing television, I had a daily show
Mhm.
about food. And a daily show is a very hungry animal. You have to keep feeding it and finding more items and more items. So I came up with this little column in the show that was called the Trauma Ward. So every day we would bring a celebrity from any field. It doesn't matter. It needn't be an actor or a singer. It could be a professor. It could be a member of parliament. It could be a writer. It doesn't matter. And we would feed her or him the dish that they hate the most. And then talk to them about why don't you like this dish? And it was actually a fine angle to look at culture.
Mhm.
And the most hated dishes are Ashkenazi dishes, I must say. Most of them chose either holodiets, which is this aspic of bones, this
Mm.
jelly of meat and bones, or gefilte fish. So I guess that yes, if you'll ask Israelis about cuisine and culture and ethnic groups, they would say that Middle Eastern food is much better than Ashkenazi food, but I disagree. Although I'm half Yemenite and a quarter Moroccan, I still think that Ashkenazi food is wonderful. I really like Polish food, although I'm not Polish. It's true that it's brown and it always looks like somebody ate it before, but still it can be wonderful. So I think that if you want to go to just to stay on the surface, you could tell people, well, your food is not good, that food is not good, etc. But once you get to the table, everybody loves everything, except for gefilte fish, which is really an atrocity.
Yeah, I agree with that because for me, it's all Ashkenazi food is wonderful besides gefilte fish, which I cannot ever try to touch. Uh,
Yes, the
I've never
question
found
is
someone that
what
genuinely likes gefilte fish.
my grandmother does.
the question is what people celebrate spring with a dead gray fish. I mean, it's not a celebration. But of course, then people always tell me, no, you must have gefilte at my aunt's because there it doesn't taste like gefilte. And I'm such an idiot that I always try it and it always tastes like gefilte fish. So
I've had it
be
fried
careful.
before and it was like tolerable, but still it tastes like gefilte fish.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, it's never very successful. Okay, so we're gonna move on to some questions about Hebrew Language Day, which is a day that I wasn't even aware that exists growing up in Israel, which is interesting. Um, so January 21st is Hebrew Language Day in Israel and around the world. And as the great-grandson of Eliezer ben Yehuda, how do you personally connect with his monumental achievements of reviving the Hebrew language during this day and in general?
I admire him. I simply admire him. He was an unpleasant person. He was a difficult man, but had it not been, it's because of him that we have a state. It's because of him that we have a culture, a language, an identity, pride. Without him, we wouldn't have these things. And we should remember that for him, Hebrew wasn't the goal, it was the means for achieving independence. And just think of what would have been or what would have happened if there was no Israel. So, some 10 years ago or so, I was invited by the Belarusian government for inaugurating a memorial site for Eliezer ben Yehuda. So they try to reclaim great culture figures from their past, some of them Jewish, like Chagall and other painters, etc., and Eliezer ben Yehuda as well. So they put his statue in the big avenue of the statues of culture figures in their culture capital in Vitebsk. And then we went on to the village or little town in which he was born as Laser Perlman in 1858, which is called Luzhki. And there was a very nice ceremony there at what was supposed to be the house he was born at. Of course, it was all a fake, but never mind. And by the end of this ceremony, they took us on a little trip 500 meters into the forest to see the place where all the Jews that were left in Luzhki, in the ghetto of Luzhki, were assassinated and buried. I looked at this blood-filled soil and I said, thank you so much, Laser Perlman, for not being religious, for being a Zionist, for getting up and moving to Palestine, for reviving Hebrew, for fighting for an independent Hebrew state. He refused to list himself as a Jew. He is listed as a Hebrew. So for founding a Hebrew state, it's because of him that I'm alive. And so
Amazing.
are you, Yahel.
Amazing. Such amazing stories to grow up with and what a legacy to kind of live through. How do you think that the revival of Hebrew has shaped Israeli society and culture today?
It wouldn't have existed without it. Although, if you read Herzl's book, Herzl was convinced that everybody would speak German
Mm.
in Israel because he came from Vienna and he thought that everybody should be Austrian in the Middle East. Um, Eliezer ben Yehuda said there are two things without which there would be no independence for the Jewish people or no existence for the Jewish people: its own land and its own language. And had we not had Hebrew, we wouldn't have been here. I would have been in a hole in the ground in Luzhki, for sure.
Wow.
How do you think, regarding what you just said now, how do you think that young Jewish students and communities around the world can participate in keeping the Hebrew language alive and vibrant? Because it's really, as you said, it's really important for us as a country, but also maybe as a nation worldwide.
Yeah, I think it's important to study languages, not only Hebrew. I think the most beautiful language in the world is Arabic, and of course, compared to Hebrew, there is no comparison between Arabic and Hebrew. Hebrew is Liechtenstein, and Arabic is the United States. I mean, it's huge, and it's cultural, and it's big, and it's sophisticated, and Hebrew is tiny. And studying Arabic, it opened so many doors for me, for culture, for literature, for meeting people, for understanding stuff. The same when I studied English and French, of course. So I think that being so privileged nowadays, where we do have some spare time or some spare money, and we can afford hobbies, I think that studying Hebrew is a wonderful idea because actually through Hebrew, many of us can communicate, even if some of us were not lucky enough to be born in Israel or to live in Israel, etc. Having said that, every year many groups of language fighters come over to the Hebrew U. I'm a graduate of the Hebrew U, to try and study or try to and understand how can you make a miracle like this happen? How can you bring a language back from the dead? It's the only case in the history of mankind of a language coming back from the dead and becoming a mother tongue. I mean, nowadays, I don't know, people can speak, can read and write Catalan in Barcelona, maybe, and they may even have street signs in Catalan. But when a child is born in Barcelona, first of all, she or he would speak Spanish, only then they would study Catalan. And only in Israel we are stupid in Hebrew, we sing in Hebrew, we die in Hebrew, we bury our dead in Hebrew, we fight in Hebrew. It's alive. And I remember once I was asked by, I think, Aborigine people in Australia when I was lecturing there, um, why did you succeed and we did not? Our languages are decaying and dying, and we cannot make them live. And I said, well, it all depends on the outcome of not speaking your language, because without trying to minimize the Holocaust that the Aboriginal people of Australia went through, still nowadays in the 21st century, if they won't speak their language, what would happen? Maybe they would be sad, maybe they would be erased, maybe they would be humiliated, but they would still be alive. Again, I remind you of that hole in the ground in Luzhki. Had we not had Eliezer ben Yehuda, we would have been dead long, long, long ago. So I think that it's something that is it's good to fight for it and to pay whatever the price is and to go through boring lessons in Sunday schools and to maybe to be a bit of a nudnik with your children if you're an Israeli living abroad and you have children who speak the language of the country and are not that interested in Hebrew. It's an asset that we should not give up easily.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of today's episode of Yalla, the podcast of Jewish students.
A big thank you to Gil.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry again for being late. Next
It's
time
okay.
I'll be on time.
No, all good. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experience and heritage. And thank you for our listeners for tuning in.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share with others who are interested in creating a safer world for us all.
You can follow UJS on all the socials and UJS UK for updates on future episodes, events, and opportunities.
If anything in this podcast or events on campus has been triggering, don't forget that UJS's 24/7 dedicated welfare support line is open. You can call us on 020 742 43281 to speak to one of our experienced staff or volunteers.
Don't forget to tune in next time to hear more incredible stories and meet some amazing people on Yalla, the podcast of Jewish students. But for now, that is goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me. See you on campus soon.